Hello, Jakarta and the world. This is Doug Johnson, and I'm White Trash Talking. Today I want to look at a recent surprise attack by HTS, which is a branch of the terrorist group ISIS, on Bashar Assad's government in Syria and the rapid fall of his government. I will focus on who is involved in the 15-year war on the Syrian people and why. And I will look at the conditions of Syria today and what it means for the long-term viability of the entire region. First of all, who started this war? Professor Jeffrey Sachs answered this question on MSNBC about 7 years ago. This is what he said.
And we know they sent in the CIA to overthrow Assad. The CIA and Saudi Arabia together in covert operations tried to overthrow Assad. It was a disaster. Eventually it brought in both ISIS as a splinter group to the jihadists that went in. It also brought in Russia. So we have been digging deeper and deeper and deeper. This is what I would call the permanent state. This is the CIA, this is Pentagon, wanting to keep Iran and Russia out of Syria, but no way to do that. And so we have made a proxy war in Syria. It's killed 500,000 people, displaced 10 million, and I'll say predictably so, because I predicted it 7 years ago that there was no way to do this and that it would make a complete chaos.
Okay, Jeffrey Sachs calls it the permanent state. This is the unelected state. That's why it's referred, it's out of the control of the electorate, or many times even just law, domestic and international law. And a lot of the policies are executed in secrecy. And that was the case this time. The operation was Timber Sycamore, which was the name of the CIA name, to overthrow Bashar Assad. And as Jeffrey Sachs said, 500,000 people died. I mean, this is an unbelievable disaster and a war crime and a tragedy. But we haven't looked at the reasons why the deep state or the permanent state did such a thing, but I'll look at that in a minute. Okay, so I want to look at Professor Morandi of Tehran University in Iran. He explains the extent of U.S. involvement in the Dirty War, as it was called, and how it crushed and devastated Syria prior to the recent overthrow by HTS and its American backers. Keep in mind that Professor Morandi from inside of Iran has been at the receiving end of this U.S. participation in the overthrow or the aggression in the region. So let's listen to him.
The United States has crushed Syria, basically, the Europeans and the Americans. They've destroyed the economy. They're stealing the oil and the agricultural products that are, the heartland is in northeastern Syria, where the Americans have occupied that area with its proxies. And they've imposed extraordinary sanctions on the people. So people are living in misery, and life is very tough. And you have Americans occupying the northeast, but also occupying the southeast. Then you have the Israelis constantly bombing Syria, both through the Mediterranean, through Jordan, and through the occupied Golan, regularly bombing Syria. Then you have these terrorists in Idlib constantly causing trouble for a government that has no money. The people are much more politically aware nowadays, and they recognize that what the dirty war in Syria was all about.
Most Americans, I would guess, don't know people from Syria. And that's understandable. The two countries are very far away. But I happen to have met an incredible family from Syria. They're refugees. I met them in Iraq when I lived and worked there. And Syrian people are just, they're like all people. They're wonderful people, and we should care about them. Yet we don't, because they're an abstraction. They're far away. They end up being a number, a casualty, and we don't know them, we don't care about them, and we're participating in their destruction and death. So Professor Morandi talked about the terrorist groups, and I'll look at those a little bit more closely in a minute. But first, I want to look at the regional map. I'll put that up and begin to sort out the various participants and their respective motivations in this war. So you have Turkey and Syria, Iran, Iraq, and then at the top you see Russia, and at the bottom left corner you see Lebanon, and below it Israel. Israel had just signed a ceasefire with Hezbollah, and as Hezbollah was regrouping and was unprepared for any offensive, Israel helped activate the dormant terrorist groups in Idlib province in Syria to take over Aleppo and continue south to head for Damascus, while Israel dropped 2,000-pound bombs on Assad's military infrastructure. Israel's intention by overthrowing Assad was, one, to cut off the supply route from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. This greatly undermines the axis of resistance against the U.S. and Israel. Also, it's to isolate and weaken Iran by removing a key ally, Syria, and it's to enable Israel, one, to finish the genocide and removal of the Palestinians, and enable it to expand its territory into Lebanon and beyond. So that's Israel's role. Turkey, on the other hand, its role has been to recruit terrorists from around the world, to arm and help train them, and to send them into Syria. And Turkey, once the seat of the Ottoman Empire, also seeks to re-expand its territory and influence. More immediately, however, is the need to solve its Kurdish problem. You can see the yellow area in this map. This is what would be the country of Kurdistan if they could have such a thing. There is no country. Instead, the Kurdish people are split among 4 countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And these 4 countries are not going to give up territory to the Kurdish people. And Turkey has been particularly brutal towards the Kurdish people and has not allowed them to practice their culture, to wear their dress, to speak their language in the schools, and they don't allow them the Kurdish autonomy in any sense. And in response to that, you have PKK Kurdish fighters on the Syrian-Turkish border who regularly go inside of Turkey and commit acts of terrorism and attack innocent people as well as military people. And so this combat has been going on for a long time. And now that there's been this overthrow of Assad, and anything goes in Syria, Turkey is now waging war on the Kurdish people in northern Syria, as I speak now. So that was one of their motivations. And another is that the U.S. promised Erdogan of Turkey a U.S.-backed Qatari oil pipeline, that it would be routed through Turkey on its way to Europe, and that Turkey would become an important energy hub to Europe. And this agreement, however, meant betraying Putin, who is allied with Iran and Syria, and who has his own plans for an oil pipeline. Okay, so I'll talk more about that pipeline in a second. But finally, the U.S. role in this, and it's as it always is, which is world hegemony. The U.S. seeks to control the energy resources in the region, and they do that through sanctions and bombing. In this particular case, they even sent in Ukrainian fighters, to train the HTS terrorists. And finally, the U.S. goal is to back Israel to ensure that they're the sole regional power, which means weakening Iran. So these are the various motivations. Of course, Russia does not want to see its BRICS allies, which is Iran. Turkey is not yet a BRICS country, and now it will never be after backstabbing Putin. But it's to protect Iran, in this case, who is a BRICS member. Okay, so that's the map. Now I want to look at the oil pipeline. And remember, every time there's a war, it's for profit. Money is the issue. Follow the money. All right, so I'm going to go back. I found a Guardian article. This is from 11 years ago. And online it actually said this article is more than 11 years old. And the title is Syria Intervention Plan Fueled by Oil Interests, Not Chemical Weapon Concern. And then the subtext is massacres of civilians are being exploited for narrow geopolitical competition to control Mideast oil gas pipelines. Okay, very interesting. All right, so in this article, it says in 2009, Assad refused to sign a proposed agreement with Qatar that would run a pipeline from the latter's North Field. Okay? And Assad's rationale was to protect the interests of his Russian ally, which is Europe's top supplier of natural gas. It was until the US bombed it. So this happened in 2009. Assad refused to sign a deal, and this is a US-backed deal. So that put Assad immediately on the hit list. They began to plan to overthrow him. And there's other geopolitical strategies in that as well, which I will mention in a second. And continuing with this article, it says, the following year, Assad pursued negotiations for an alternative $10 billion pipeline plan with Iran across Iraq and Syria. So not only did they refuse the American proposed pipeline with Qatar, they planned their own with Iran and going a different route. And this was, they call it a slap in the face to Qatar's plans. Well, it was more than a slap in the face. It meant the loss of billions of dollars to US corporations. All right, so and then at the bottom of this page it says, the problem of establishing a pliable opposition which the US and its oil allies feel confident will play ball pipeline style in a post-Assad Syria, that will determine the nature of any prospective intervention, not concern for Syrian life. So he's saying in a nutshell, the issue here is not freedom for Syrians, it's not to bring them a better life. In fact, the US has destroyed Syria. The sanctions are still in place. They've crushed Syria. They've impoverished Syria. They don't care about the Syrians. They want the oil. Okay, so that's what's going on there, and it's in this Guardian mainstream article, going back to 2000 and I don't know what year this was written, but 11 years ago, so 2013. Okay, so let's look at the oil map, oil pipeline map. This is very telling. So you have two proposed pipelines. The red one is the Russian-backed pipeline, and the second one is the US-backed pipeline, the blue one. And they're both coming out of basically the same region in the Gulf, Sea of Oman, right off of the Iranian coast. One's right off the Qatari coast. Okay, so, but you'll see both pipelines go through Syria. This is interesting, and it's very telling, because Assad ruled out the blue pipeline, and he approved the red pipeline. So for both reasons, Assad needed to be removed. This is the corporate thinking. And to have the US-backed oil pipeline go through Turkey, Assad needed to go. And it took a long time, but they finally achieved that goal. Let's see if they can build the pipeline. I doubt it. Yeah, there's that map. And what I want to do now is listen further to Professor Morandi talk about conditions inside of Syria. Let's listen.
The misery that we see in Syria today was because of the sanctions. It was because of the dirty war. Syria, which was a prosperous country in 2011, is a country that is broken. And today we've seen scenes that are similar to when the Americans occupied Baghdad. You know, all their assets are being stolen. Everything is being taken away. There's no security. There's no government. The only difference is that Iraq has oil and Syria is under American occupation. And the Americans are not going to remove the sanctions. They'll provide conditions, and conditions that they will not be able to meet, as we've experienced in Iran. Why would the Americans remove sanctions? Have they removed sanctions in Cuba? And by the way, this is what they're doing in Cuba too. They're creating massive dissatisfaction through, crushing sanctions, and Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and elsewhere. So the tools of sanctions are something that the Americans are using to crush a people and then take over.
He has lived many years within these sanctions in Iran, and his description is apt, crushing, soul crushing. It's, I can't even imagine. And the reason I'm playing this is just to show the pattern of behavior of the U.S. towards the world. And you should begin to recognize this pattern played out over and over and over again. When the U.S. wants something that's under the feet of other people, they will do anything to take it. And if it's not given willingly, they take it by force. Okay. Now I want to listen to Matt Ho. He's a former U.S. soldier and now a spokesperson for peace.
The Syrian war of the last decade plus, more than 500,000 dead, millions and millions made refugees, a country destroyed. It's still destroyed. Purposes are for reasons that have nothing to do with the Syrian people, reasons that have nothing to do with America's own security, but everything to do with this imperialist vision of playing chess or playing a real life game of Risk. Essentially, what you have, Judge, in Washington, D.C., are people who are acolytes of Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, and they think that by this type of action, this type of great game in the Middle East, it will enhance the American empire and also as well enhance their own personal and institutional interests.
Yeah, that's also a common thread of U.S. foreign policy is planners of war are not dealing with human lives. They're dealing with inanimate chess pieces. There's no human interest in this. It's just using people to achieve a gain or removing people to confiscate a resource and so on. Let's listen to Matt Ho further.
The United States military is physically present in Syria, helping people to fight to overthrow the government, and the United States condones that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We condone it. We don't just condone it. We support it in a number of different ways. Over the last decade and a half in Syria, we've seen the United States do everything from bombing to sending weapons off into groups that would fight one another, but then also too controlling, by having our troops there, the ability for Syria to rebuild. And there are allegations that are very substantial and should be taken seriously, that where does this oil in eastern Syria go to? That it gets trucked to the Israelis. So, I mean, the whole thing keeps it's a complicated, ugly mess. It is a horror show. The nightmare for the Syrian people just doesn't seem to end. And it's all because of these imperialist, Machiavellian, grand chessboard type ambitions of Washington, D.C., that we see these things continuing to play out.
And this is also normalized. It's hard for me to deal with this. And I'm looking for the right words to say to break through this ideology of normalization of this violence and this behavior. But it's very, very difficult to penetrate it. I mean, how can people tolerate this? How can people not be upset by this and outraged and refusing to cooperate with any of this inside the U.S. and elsewhere? And, you know, like, for example, Jake Sullivan, it was revealed by WikiLeaks, not WikiLeaks, but WikiLeaks, that he wrote an email to his boss, Hillary Clinton, when he was a foreign policy advisor to her. And in the email, it said, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. I mean, come on. How can we condone this? Al-Qaeda that attacked the Twin Towers on 9/11 years earlier, now we're in cahoots with? And the leader of that Al-Qaeda movement now, Jelani, he was on the terrorist hit list, and the U.S. had a bounty out for him. If you could capture him, they'd pay you millions of dollars. He was the #1 wanted guy. Now he's the leader of Syria with U.S. backing. How? This just shows you the U.S. will do anything to get what they want. These corporations that want the oil, you better not get in their way. This is lawlessness. Okay. Finally, I want to listen to Alistair Crook. He's a former British ambassador, and I just think he does a good job of describing what's happening right now on the ground inside of Syria.
I fear for what will be coming. It's already mayhem, the sort of attacks going on, people living in I mean, the presidential palace has been stripped and looted. Assad's old house has been similarly stripped. The central bank, we've seen people coming out with sackloads of cash. They've just raided the bank. They've taken everything. There have been executions. I've seen pictures of a hanging of a member of Assad's family, allegedly, but the hanging is very visible. And there have been reports of executions taking place in Aleppo. I think, this was entirely predictable that HTS would establish, because this is what they did in Idlib. They established a really brutal control, Wahhabist control, that is an extreme form of Islamist control over Idlib when Jelani was in charge of it. And anyone who disagreed with him, woe betide them.
Woe betide. So it's predictable that these various factions will wage war against each other. Government capacities will break down. Conditions will worsen in Syria. And the countries in the region will be threatened as these elements reach their borders and the chaos spreads. So the U.S. has not done anything good. The U.S. started this, and it's a terrorist act by a country that often engages in terroristic acts around the world. And I don't know why people don't condemn the U.S. behavior more strongly and more often, because they are at the source of this. They're the ones, the U.S. are the ones that made this possible and have destroyed Syria. Okay. If you like what I've said, please give it a like. Please subscribe. If you don't like what I said, I'd love it if you send me a comment and tell me why. We can have a civil discussion about it. All right? I'm posting once a week. I'll see you next week. This is White Trash Talking. I'm Doug Johnson. Thank you. Bye.